In 2016, the American singer-songwriter Katy Perry told Cosmopolitan magazine, "I'd love it if the world implemented an actual day of rest, a worldwide day when we're not on our phones. If only there was a day when we could in good conscience say no to work, no matter how pressing. If only there was a day when we could switch off our screens and focus on what's really important. If only." Of course, the tragedy is that we have been given such a gift, but it's a gift that many, even within the church, don't think they want or need. For many today, the idea of devoting a whole day to God seems burdensome, legalistic, and just not practical. But think of what good news this commandment would have been to those standing at the foot of Mount Sinai. They had just been freed from slavery, having never had a day off, being forced to make bricks without straw, but now they're free. What a gift the Sabbath would have been to them. And surely we live in a society that needs to rediscover the Sabbath. In 1930, there was a British economist called John Maynard Keynes, and he predicted that the grandchildren of those around in his day would only work 3 hours a day, and the only reason that they'd work at all was because they chose to work. By his day, there'd been economic progress and technological advances to the extent that the working week, the working day had shrunk, and he expected that trend to continue, that as cars got faster, as more time-saving tools and appliances were invented, there would be more speed and less drudgery. Psychologists began to worry what people would do with all their free time. Well, nearly 100 years later, that hasn't turned out to be one of the world's most pressing problems. The grandchildren of those who were around in the 1930s didn't end up working 3 hours a day. In fact, the opposite has happened. There is a worldwide epidemic of busyness and overwork. In Japan, they don't have a term for work-life balance, but there is a word for death by overwork. Karoshi is a recognized cause of death. It describes those who suffer a fatal heart attack or stroke, or who commit suicide because of overwork. Rather than reduce our working hours, technology has in many cases made it worse. Laptops and mobile phones make it harder to switch off from work. Various countries have brought in rules to try and protect employees from work email outside of office hours. A recent study in the UK said that a culture of all work and no play is damaging family life, causing high stress levels, cutting time spent with loved ones, and creating an inability to switch off from work. And it's no coincidence that the rise of these problems has coincided with the decline of the Lord's Day. We've ended up in a place where even many Christians are more familiar with the concept of burnout than they are with the concept of Sabbath. There's much that could be said about the fourth commandment, but this morning we just want to consider two misconceptions about it. And the first misconception is that it was just for the Jews. It was just for the Jews. Eric Liddell is one of the best known Scottish sportsmen of all time. But unlike most famous sportsmen, Liddell is known as much for what he didn't do as for what he did do. His story is powerfully told in the film Chariots of Fire. In the 1924 Olympics in Paris, he missed out on his best event, the 100 metres, because he refused to run in the heat for the race, which was on a Sunday. Unable to run his preferred distance, he took part in the 400 metres instead. On the morning of the race, one of the team masseurs handed him a piece of paper with a Bible verse on it. It read, "Those who honour me, I will honour." And Eric Liddell not only won gold, but he set a new world record. More recently, the Scottish rugby player Ewan Murray refused to play on Sundays or even do interviews with Christian newspapers because of his Christian faith. And there are more sportsmen and women we could point to who've missed out on sporting glory because of their belief that Sunday is to be kept special. So were they right to take a stand? Would they have been sinning if they took part? Now, of course, we would expect the world to say that they were misguided. We don't expect those who aren't Christians to be convinced of the need to set apart a day for God. But it's not just those outside the church who would say that Liddell and Murray and others were misguided. Many in the church would say they were misguided too. Many Christians, in effect, believe that only 9 of the 10 commandments still apply today. They would argue that the idea of keeping one day holy was new at the time of Moses, and it was just a command for the Jews. They would say that it's one of those Old Testament commands that are no longer binding on Christians because Jesus has fulfilled it. So, do they have a point? Well, there are many ways we could approach that question, but just for now, notice how the commandment begins. Because the 4th commandment begins differently from all the others. Boys and girls, did you notice what the first word of the 4th commandment is? It's the word remember. Not you shall not, as many commandments do, but remember. And the fact that it begins with the word remember suggests at least 2 things. Firstly, it's a commandment that we will be tempted to forget. In the busyness of life, with the pressure of work and family life, in cultures where the shops are open and big sports fixtures take place, it will be oh so easy to forget the Sabbath. The word remember also tells us that this commandment, like all the 10 commandments, wasn't a new commandment. It is as old as Eden, and it is rooted in creation. Another question, boys and girls: how many days did it take for God to make the world? Because a lot of people will hear that question and they will say 7. But of course the right answer is 6. Genesis 2 verse 2, and on the 7th day God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all the work that he had done. And that has implications for us. It would have implications for humanity going forward. Genesis 2 verse 3, so God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all the work that he had done in creation. And so the Sabbath predates sin coming into the world. Along with marriage and work, it is what's known as a creation ordinance. Someone has put it like this: in a good world, in a world without sin, it was better for a man to have a wife, work, and Sabbath. In a good world, it was better for a man to have a wife, work, and a Sabbath. And in fact, so much trouble in our world is a result of these creation ordinances being ignored. Marriage is redefined, family life is attacked. The state often makes it easier for people not to work than to work. And the Sabbath is desecrated. Imagine that archaeologists found some relic from the Garden of Eden, some rock or something that had been there right back at the beginning. Think of the excitement there would be. This is a rock that Adam and Eve sat on. But we do have something that was there in Eden. The Sabbath was there in Eden. And it's still there. It's there all the way through the Bible. When we get to the last book of the Bible, there is still a day set apart. John tells us that he was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. Under the new covenant, there is still a whole day to be devoted to the Lord. So it wasn't just for the Jews. It existed long before there was such a thing as a Jew. And then when Jesus came, who did he say the Sabbath was made for? He didn't say the Sabbath was made for Jews. He said the Sabbath was made for man. God gave the fourth commandment not because the Jews were Jews, but because they were human. And in fact, the reason attached to the fourth commandment here applies to everyone. Verse 11. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and he rested on the seventh day. Why should we remember the Sabbath in Stranraer in 2025? Because God worked 6 days and rested one day. That's the pattern that was set in the beginning, before sin entered the world. And then the book of Deuteronomy gives us an additional reason. The Ten Commandments, as I mentioned to the children earlier, are repeated in Deuteronomy 5. Which shouldn't be surprising because the name Deuteronomy means second law. When Moses went over everything again in that sermon on the verge of the promised land. And Deuteronomy 5:15 gives an additional reason for keeping the Ten Commandments. Not simply creation, but also redemption. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. And we today are people that God has redeemed. So both because of creation and redemption, we have the obligation and the privilege to keep the Sabbath. Now, it's true that God gave the Jews laws that we aren't called to observe today. Laws about sacrifices, laws about what not to eat, what not to wear. But those were only after sin came into the world. They only applied to the Jews in the Promised Land. The Sabbath, however, was in place from creation. And there were also particular days that the Jews were called to observe that we are not called to observe. The annual Day of Atonement, for example, which is described in Leviticus as a Sabbath of solemn rest. Similarly, every seventh year, we're told in Leviticus 25, was to be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land. We could talk about the Feast of Trumpets as well. That helps us understand why in the New Testament the Apostle Paul will say things like he does in Romans 14 when he's talking about the weaker brother. One person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all day alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. As we saw recently from Acts 21, there were some Jewish religious practices that Paul allowed Christians to keep following, as long as they weren't trusting in them for salvation. It was like the grace period you get when new banknotes are introduced or new stamps are introduced. You get a year or however long to keep using the old ones. And for the Jews, this grace period would come to an end with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. But until then, they could still circumcise their children if they wanted to. There were certain days that some Jewish believers kept observing. days like the Day of Atonement, the Feast of Trumpets, and so on. So Paul isn't talking about the weekly Sabbath. And we know that because the New Testament churches clearly didn't esteem all days alike, in the sense that there was no weekly day of rest and worship. You know, maybe you've even had someone quote Romans 14:5 at you when you said that we keep Sunday special, and they said, well, Paul says that some esteem all days alike, some esteem some days as more important than others, each one just must be convinced in his own mind. But the New Testament churches clearly treated one day as different. Jesus rose on the first day of the week. He didn't meet with the disciples again until the following Sunday. The early church met on the first day of the week, and the references are in your handout. Money was to be set aside on the first day of every week. Jesus poured out his Spirit on a Sunday, the day of Pentecost. He gave the Apostle John the vision recorded for us in the book of Revelation on the Lord's Day. The fourth commandment, written in stone, remains valid for all people in all ages of history. So that's the first misconception about the fourth commandment, that it was just for the Jews. The second misconception is that it is simply a day of rest. The second misconception, that it is simply a day of rest. This second misconception may be more relevant to many of us or to people we know. Someone who is converted from the world or who comes into a Reformed church from another church background may have no concept of the Sabbath. They might not have heard of it, or they might have been told that it doesn't apply anymore. And so they need shown that it's something that applies to all mankind. But for people who've been in a Reformed church for a while, there may be a general consciousness that Sunday is meant to be special. That it's not a day for work. In the words of verse 10 here, on it you shall do no work. It's not a day when employers should be asking people to work, unless that work is essential and can't be left to another day without endangering life or having other extraordinary consequences. So nurses, for example, are okay to work on the Lord's Day, or doctors or emergency services, though again, that wouldn't mean working every Lord's Day. Farmers don't need to cut silage on a Sunday, even if rain is forecast for Monday, but they do need to feed their animals and milk their cows. There's also an obligation on each of us not to cause other people to work. Verse 10 goes on it you shall do no work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock or your sojourner who is within your gates. Someone asked me during the week, why do we not go to shops on Sunday? They understood that we're not meant to work in a shop, but why not go if the shops are open anyway? But of course the reason, or at least part of the reason, is that it would be causing others to work. If no one went to a shop on Sundays, the shops would close. The only reason they open is because people go. And we should look on shop workers like the stranger within our gates. We're not to work on the day ourselves, and we're not to do things that require other people to work. But once we've stopped our normal work, and if we're careful not to cause other people to work, is that us now keeping the Sabbath? I think many would say yes. But let's think again about who the Sabbath commandment was given to at Mount Sinai. The Sabbath was given to freed slaves. But freedom for the Christian is never freedom to serve ourselves. We're freed in order that we might serve God. We're freed from a harsh taskmaster who hates us to serve a loving master who loves us. Because as Bob Dylan sang, you gotta serve somebody. And that's pictured in the Ten Commandments as a whole. God frees his people from slavery in Egypt and then gives them the Ten Commandments to show what true freedom looks like. Think about driving. True freedom isn't everyone driving their car whatever way they want. Some people driving one way on the motorway, others driving straight at them in the same lane because they're exercising their freedom to drive in whatever lane or whatever direction they want. No, it would be carnage. Freedom and rules are not opposites. Freedom and rules are not opposites. And the service of God is perfect freedom. And so the rest of the Lord's Day isn't a rest in and of itself, but it's a rest in order to worship. Rest in order to devote ourselves to the things of God. Rest from secular employments and thoughts, that we might give ourselves to spiritual employments and thoughts. God's rest on the seventh day, it was a rest from his work of creation, but it wasn't rest in the sense of inactivity. When Jesus was accused of getting someone to break the Sabbath by healing a man and telling him to pick up his bed, how did Jesus respond? John 5:17, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." There's a beautiful passage about the Sabbath at the end of Isaiah 58. It begins, "If you turn back your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure in my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight." And notice the emphasis. If you turn back your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, if you honor it not going your own ways or seeking your own pleasure, then you shall take delight in the Lord. But rather we're to seek the things of God. We also need to remember the form that the Ten Commandments are in. The form they're in is to tell us what we're not to do, but that is not the whole story. Can you keep the sixth commandment simply by not murdering your neighbour or not being angry with him? No, we are to love our neighbour as ourselves, but it is simpler to state the negative, to say what we're not to do, than to list all the positive things that we are to do. But the rest of Scripture fills out the positive. It's like the Ten Commandments give us one side of the coin, but the rest of Scripture fills out the other side. For example, the eighth commandment is, "You shall not steal." But can you keep the eighth commandment simply by not stealing, but not doing anything productive with your life? Well, no. Paul says in Ephesians 4, "Let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor, doing honest work with his own hands, so that he may have something to share with anyone in need." So what are the positive duties of the fourth commandment? In other words, we know that you shall not, but what about the you shall? Well, first and foremost is gathering with God's people to worship him. And we could show this by going to examples in the New Testament of people meeting together on the first day of the week, some of which I've already mentioned. We could go to Hebrews 10 and the command about not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some. But my worry is that some today are stressing the rest aspect of the Sabbath to the extent that they are starting to talk about taking a rest from church. To give a concrete example, it's becoming increasingly common to hear of churches cancelling their services the Sunday after Christmas. Particularly mega churches where they have thousands of people and they require lots of volunteers to run their sound systems, their lighting, their car parking, their youth programs and whatever. Say Christmas has been on a Wednesday or a Thursday and they've maybe had a carol service the Sunday before and then a midnight service on Christmas Eve and then another service on Christmas Day. All things the Bible doesn't tell us to do. But then they get to the next Lord's Day, the 28th or 29th of December or whatever it is, the day that God has actually told us to set apart for Him, the only holy day under the New Testament. And they'll say, well, we're going to have a church-wide Sabbath instead. Stay at home with your family, we're going to have a church-wide Sabbath. Well, for a start, if you need an army of volunteers to run a church service, something has probably gone wrong. But the idea that we need a Sabbath from church is to get things completely upside down. Sabbath rest isn't rest as an end in itself. It is rest that we might devote the day to God. Verse 11 here tells us that the day is holy. That means it's set apart to God. Paul Levy, who will be the speaker at the RP International Conference in Wales next summer, he puts it like this. He says, in a world where weekends away are sacrosanct, as Christians we'll be different because there's a day that we want to spend with God's people worshipping together. That's our priority. You know, if the Sabbath is just about a day of rest, then yeah, just go for a weekend away, have a rest from your work. But no, the priority for Christians is worship and fellowship. Psalm 18:3 says, I call upon the Lord because He is worthy to be praised. What would we be saying if we chose not to go to church on any given Sunday? If we were physically able to be there and there was no absolute emergency keeping us away, well, we would be saying by choosing not to be at worship that the Lord is not worthy to be praised, but that something else was more important, that something else was more worthy of our time and devotion. So I'm concerned that some see the need for physical rest as a reason not to go to church from time to time, when actually the whole reason we were created was to worship and glorify God. Worshipping God with His people on the Lord's Day should be the number one priority of our weeks. Whereas for many, their work is their number one priority. And the Lord's Day has to fit around that if it fits in at all. If someone is exhausted because of their work, the answer isn't to skip church and rest, but to reevaluate their work situation. Cut out literally anything else, but don't miss church. Based on Genesis 1 and 2, someone has put it like this. We human beings are at our most human, not so much when we work, as when we lay aside our work in order to worship. We human beings are at our most human, not so much when we work, but when we lay aside our work in order to worship. But then to take it a step further, we don't keep the Lord's Day simply by going to church as if it were a box to tick before we go and do other things. Think of the example in Acts 2 of the early Christians being devoted to the fellowship. In light of that, I would say that someone who goes to church and then immediately leaves and barely says a word to their fellow believers isn't keeping the Sabbath. What is the command in Hebrews 10? Not neglecting to meet together as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another. And that also applies to the person who decides not to go to any church, but simply to stay at home and watch a service online. On one level, it might seem like they're doing the same thing as the people who actually go to church. But we can't be devoted to the fellowship if we're watching on a screen. We can't love our Christian neighbour if we choose not to worship alongside them. And we won't be loving our non-Christian neighbour if they walk into a church and there's no one to talk to them because everyone is at home watching on a screen. And if someone is converted, we're not loving them if there isn't a warm fellowship of believers for them to come into because people have decided that it's easier to check out physically and watch online. We live in a day and age where someone could spend every weekend at the caravan, watch a service online, and think that they've kept the Lord's Day holy. And much of that misconception stems from the idea that the Lord's Day is simply a day of rest. That it's not a day that brings obligations to our fellow believers and obligations to the lost. Think of Jesus' words, "It is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Not a day defined by inactivity, but activity. A Sabbath well spent is defined not by what we don't do, but by what we do. William Symington, a previous minister of this congregation, has a very helpful quote. I've put part of it on the bulletin, where he talks about works of necessity and mercy, not simply as things that we may do on the Sabbath, but things we must do. What those works look like won't look exactly the same for all of us, but they could involve visiting someone who's in hospital or housebound, or phoning them. It could involve having people to your home, or helping with church lunch or church supper to facilitate fellowship. It could involve having a non-Christian neighbour round after evening worship, and maybe they ask you about your day, and you tell them something you heard at church. You know, personally, I get the attraction. I see the attraction of going to church and then retreating home, perhaps to read a Christian book, not fellowshipping or seeking to encourage other believers or thinking about the lost. But there is a better way. The Lord's Day is not simply a day of rest. It is lawful. In fact, it is required of Christ's people to do good on the Sabbath. Jesus went about doing good, and often in the Gospels we see him doing good, healing people on the Sabbath. Not just as an exception to the day that, yes, okay, he can do it because he's healing people, but because it is particularly fitting to heal people and help people on the Lord's Day. And actually, if we're devoting ourselves to worship and fellowship, as the early Christians did, then many of the practical questions about what we can or can't do on the Lord's Day answer themselves. So to sum it up, the worldwide day of rest that Katy Perry craves and that our 24/7 world desperately needs, it exists. It's one of God's greatest gifts to us. And we have undervalued and underappreciated it to our incalculable loss. Like the other 9 commandments, every single one of us has failed to keep it. But as with the other 9 commandments, there is hope. Because Jesus kept this commandment perfectly, just as he did the rest. And then he went to the cross, where he paid the penalty we deserved for breaking this and all the other commandments. On this Lord's Day, you have heard about Jesus. Have you put your trust in him? Because he still desires to heal and to give life on the Sabbath. And if your trust is in him, what you do with the Lord's Day may make or break your Christian life. If you honour it, not going your own ways or seeking your own pleasure or talking idly, then you shall delight in the Lord. And I will make you ride on the heights of the earth. I will feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. Amen. Well, we'll finish with Psalm 111, Psalm 111, starting on page 277. We'll sing the opening 2 verses and then the closing 2. Psalm 111, 1 and 2, and then the final 2 verses, 8 and 9. Verse 1 contains one of the I wills of the psalm there in the second line, where the child of God resolves that whatever those around me are doing, this is what I will do. Others may be shopping or taking their family on a day trip or playing sport or trying to get caught up in work. But I will, the Lord, extol within the council of the just and congregation all. Verse 2, I won't be satisfied with the minimum I can get away with on the Lord's Day. One service just to tick a box and then get on with my own interests. Why? Well, because the works that by the Lord are done are very great in might, and they are studied by all those who in them do delight. And then over the page, why will we keep the day holy? Verse 8, because he has redeemed us from slavery. He sent redemption to his folk. And then verse 9, why does our week start with worship? Because the one who fears the Lord has learned the first of wisdom's ways. How tragic it is when parents will make sure that their child never misses school, but they'll not take the same attitude to the Lord's Day. Because only when we fear the Lord do we learn the first of wisdom's ways. And then in the last line, his praise will last forever. To worship him is to do what the believer in Christ will do for all eternity. And if that is what we're saying we will do for all eternity, will we not delight to do it while we're here on earth? So Psalm 111, 1 and 2, 8 and 9, if you're able, we'll stand to sing.